Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to your conference and to this particularly awesome hotel. If we were at a Scandinavian conference right now, I'd ask us to throw open the windows to the face-slappingly cold air. I'd ask us to jump out of our seats and get the blood pumping around our bodies. And I'd ask us to sing a song. At the moment, we seem to be in Manchester. We threw open the windows earlier to the sound of screeching brakes. So a Scandinavian start to the morning is definitely out. I don't know whether that's good news or bad news, but I hope you've had a fantastic breakfast, are feeling awake and perky. So no song singing, and I'm going to kick straight off into it. So I'm going to talk about one of the temptations with technical challenges, which is when we get a logjam, is to either increase the technology or increase the complexity of the technical system that we're working with. So the temptation is throw more technology, throw more complexity at it, because obviously it's a technical problem and we need more tech. What we don't tend to do is to simplify the challenge that the technology is wedged into, or make radical changes in our tactics, like thinking about the way that we're thinking, which is philosophy, which always sounds kind of scary, or it sounds particularly inane and not really useful. The other thing that we try not to do is take radical risks. We've got an investment of technology and completely trying a different way, bringing in new skill sets, working in a multidisciplinary way, collaboration, feels rather left field, and it's not something that we're tempted to do. So I'm just going to talk about a particular event that got me very conscious about the way that I was thinking, particularly about technical challenges. So in 2010, I'm at the University of Tokyo, and I'm presenting my findings on this. This is a smart droplet system. I don't expect you to know anything at all about smart droplets. Hopefully we'll understand a little bit more about them by the end of this talk. But it's really not about this. This kind of just represents a challenge, okay? And I'm thinking about this as a simple form of artificial life. Therefore, I'm trying to define it technically in terms of the operations that it conducts. It moves around its environment. It interacts with other droplets. It can produce microstructures. The list goes on and on and on. And I'm thinking about, well, so what other kinds of lifelike behaviors can I cram into this system so that I can unlock its potential? And at the time, I think there's very little value in looking at this as some kind of coherent program, just because the functions of life are so highly contested and varied. And so anyway, I present my paper, and it takes its place alongside a host of strange new forms of computing, which have all come under this umbrella term unconventional computing. You might also hear it talked about as morphological computing or natural computing. And essentially what these overlapping fields of research are doing are trying to move beyond the Turing codes and von Neumann structures of traditional computation, and looking at different ways of engineering. So morphological computing comes from an engineering background where they try to use the body of the system to solve challenges. Unconventional computing itself is IT-led. Natural computing also includes artists trying to digitally model biological systems and look at the behaviors of slime molds, crystal growths. People are even documenting how machines can actually tune themselves mysteriously into the weather. I'm not kidding about this. Technology can be strange. And so this group of experts are together trying to think about, where the next trends in computing are coming from. How can we actually develop new technical systems that we can start to understand the world with? So despite all this research activity going on, I'm still having a problem trying to see how a droplet could really be a computer. Okay, and I kind of, I want to understand it as a computer, but at the moment all I can do is understand it as a term of lists of things that it might do. So at the end of the conference, I decided to take an optional day extra. It's really, really, really popular. It's to go from Tokyo to Nikko, which is the home of Shinto. Okay, and it's 125 kilometers away from Tokyo. These are fish in a pond in Nikko. You'll find that the graphics that I use, some of them are directly relevant to what I'm saying, some of them are a bit more wallpapery. This is more of a wallpapery background, just in case you're wondering. So this is a really, really popular trip. And all the seats are full, and I end up sitting next to a French woman. And since we were going to spend a couple of hours together, we started talking. Now, Françoise Chatelain, in my view, is a rare thing. She's a female mathematician. She'd been described as a child genius, but quickly tired of her scholarship at a university in Paris, considering the contemporary curriculum too unchallenging. Gosh. And then she went to work for IBM. She later returned to academia, where she's professor of mathematics at the University of Toulouse and head of qualitative computing group at Surfax. So Françoise Chatelain is not somebody I made up. You can look up her name on the internet. Please do. She's amazing. And I just want to say that this is a real encounter, which really got me thinking. Her areas of expertise include, I have to read this, okay, so make sure I get it right, includes spectral theory for linear operators in Banach spaces. I looked up what they are. I still can't tell you simply. And finite precision computation of very large eigenproblems, which is something to do with stretchiness. She was a contemporary of Benoit Mandelbrot. So, you know, the fractals and Julia sets and chaos mathematics. So this is the field in which this lady's mind is continuing to expand, actually. Now, my mathematics extends to OA level. Very proud of that. I can grasp concepts like algebra and calculus, and occasionally I can even solve them. But I am certainly no expert in mathematics. Even Francois' professional interests are like dark matter to me, impossible to conceive, let alone prove. However, to my eternal surprise, the conversation that unfolded on the bus not only changed my research perspectives, but was also one of the most interesting and far-reaching conversations that I've ever had, and it was all about mathematics. Now, not being particularly good at small talk, I'm really bad. I'm not particularly good at small talk. I kind of welly in there. I asked Françoise if it was possible that anyone had used mathematics to describe life. I was expecting her to tell me about Carl Sims and his floppy little geometries, or William Latham and his evolving techno shells that, you know, this artist created on computers, or genetic algorithms, or cellular automata, things that I might stand a chance of being able to hold a conversation about. So once I find out that she's a mathematical genius, I'm trying to map out some territory that I stand some chance of getting some traction in. Yet oddly and rather uncomfortably, Françoise takes a big deep breath and she asks me a very simple question. She asked me, why do we count? But I wasn't expecting something that seemed so basic and simple to be such an infernal challenge. And there was no escape. I was here for the next 2 hours. I mean, I felt stupid, like really stupid. I've been counting as long as I remember. It's the very first and probably the only thing that I remember from primary school. Well, probably except the time when Mrs. James and her nasty clanging bell told me off for wearing yellow shoes as we lined up outside the classroom ready to go back into our lessons. We counted rabbits and horses and cups and spoons and houses and trains and fingers and toes, and we even counted numbers, like sweeping moves around the hands of a clock again and again and again. And for the life of me, I could not recall any point where I'd actually bothered to ask myself why I was doing any of this. To cut a long, 2-hour-long, tortuous and rather personal struggle short, Francois eventually had me understanding why for 40 years or so I'd been engaged in such a dark art. Counting could be actually considered fundamental to our species as a way of sorting and ordering the world in the quest for knowledge. She called this art of counting, sorting and ordering computing. All of a sudden I kind of understood that, that this was something that I could now get my head into. But Françoise had observed that the modern form of computing is based on a particular way of counting that does not allow us to deal with all possible challenges that we may encounter. And she particularly noted that these challenges occur in the natural world. For example, I didn't recall counting air at school, or relationships, or things that were constantly changing, like reflections on the surface of water. If I had to count any of these things, I'd have to turn it into a countable geometric form, or a volume that could be imagined as if it was a solid, or translate light dancing on the surface of water into a series of static patterns, or meta-patterns. But why was this all such a problem? I mean, it seems to have served us well for hundreds of years. Actually, I'd assumed that today's counting systems had been around for at least a couple of millennia. But of course, Françoise reminded me that 0 was an invention to symbolize empty space that appeared about the year 1600, actually 1598 to be precise, whilst John Wallis introduced the infinity symbol a little later in 1655. I tried to imagine a world without the concept of 0 and infinity. While I could not conceive of a world without a 0, it seemed that digital computing would continue quite happily without the concept of infinity. As little as I understand about mathematics, I'm aware that modern computing deals with finitudes. In other words, to compute in modern terms, we have to be able to draw a box around a solution space and say this is where the challenge stops. Yet the infinite possibilities that drive evolution, say, within nature, occupy what Stuart Kauffman describes as the adjacent possible, which is effectively a space with infinite potential. Now, Françoise wanted to make sure that the practice of computing did not become so remote from theories of numbers or mathematical developments that we would effectively become trapped within only one model or simulation of the world. Indeed, in her qualitative computing book, she observed that the meaning of the very act of computation recedes from sight as we are increasingly surrounded by a digital world which separates us from our basic nature. So she was kind of cynical about just having one form of computing. She had no problems with digital computing, but she didn't think it should be the only way that we computed. So in particular, Françoise noted that high technology industries are in desperate need for adequate tools to assess the validity of the simulations produced by ever faster computers for what she called perennial unstable problems, which may occur during modeling complex systems, such as the behavior of markets. So in order to meet these industrial expectations, applied mathematicians are faced with two formidable challenges. The first is nonlinearity, where outputs are not proportional to inputs, and coupling, the degree to which a program relies on the performance of other modules. So Françoise proposed to use a different kind of counting to address this challenge. Firstly, she proposed to use hypercomputation, which is a form of computing that goes beyond or is incomparable to Turing computability. That was what we were all kind of trying to do at this unconventional computing conference. And specifically, her thing was to apply quadratic algebras as opposed to the traditional approach that uses linear vector spaces. Again, that's a bit of technical detail that, you know, is just her way of doing it. Secondly, she complements classic linear logic with complex logic that expresses the creative potential of complex planes. Okay, I have no idea what this actually means in practice, other than Françoise, again, was using another set of counting, complex numbers with imaginary components, not natural numbers, which are the workhorses of modern computing to do this. So Françoise told me that qualitative computing, in other words, the way we sort, count and order, has been the driving force for the evolution of mathematics since Pythagoras presented the first incompleteness result about the irrationality of the square root of 2. She contrasted this with the classic logic of Aristotle, which she considered to be too limited to capture the dynamics of nonlinear computation. So as things get very, very complex, instead of producing a more complex version of what everyone was doing right now, she was trying to think of a different way of counting in order to access new spaces. That's the way that I was reading what she was saying to me. But Françoise did believe that mathematics provides us with the ways forwards in dealing with an increasing complex and messy reality. That our philosophical engagement with numbers is the missing tool, the organic logic, which can be tailored to the dynamics of nonlinearity, a logic that she believed could even become the core of a mathematics for life, which she believes will be developed during this century. So if you're interested in Françoise's thesis, she's written about her ideas and produced proofs in a book called Qualitative Computing. It's published by World Scientific. I can strongly recommend the first and last chapters of this book, which I've actually read. And her viewpoint is very clear. However, I've been unable to deal with the mathematical proofs and other chapters, but that is more of my own failing and nothing to do with the rigor of Françoise's arguments. So as we stand by the Kegon Falls, where Miso Fujimura, a Japanese philosophy student and poet, compared his farewell poem directly on the trunk of a tree before plunging to his death, I felt some connection with the tragic youth's words, "To end is to start, to surrender is to know." And I knew that I would have to look again at the system I was working on following this conversation with Françoise to see if, with a different view of counting, I could imagine it from a new perspective and try to unlock more of its creative potential. So back in the laboratory, it was immediately clear that just as Françoise had told me, modern computing and the way that I was looking at what I was doing is based on a particular way of thinking about numbers, a particular philosophy that dealt with, for example, universality, that rules applied equally to all situations, finitude, in other words, there are limits to questions and space has an end to it, discontinuity, in other words, numbers are discrete things and not all joined up together. So I decided I was going to look at my droplet system differently, not as a stripped down version of life which I was trying to accrue more properties on, but as a different kind of instrument, as a system that could help me count in a different way, even if I can't imagine how I was counting. I was going to work with this droplet to try and see if I could count, sort and order things in new ways. But firstly, I needed to establish for myself, from an architectural perspective, because that's the field that I work in, why this was an important thing to do. So, from Françoise's concern, which was to do really with high-tech industry, my interests are really quite culturally located. And what was interesting for me was that for the first time in a couple of millennia, Western civilization has started to understand reality through a different lens. So rather than seeing the world as being made up of as a series of hierarchically ordered objects, which characterizes the industrial era, we now view existence as being also in a state of permanent flux. Now, we could call this engagement with permanent flux and constant change, an ecological era. It's asking us to do some new things that we've really not been very familiar with before. Now, being part of this is not a conscious decision. It is being shaped, particularly in this last century, by a range of overlapping developments in philosophy, science, technology, cultural theory, right across the board. And our participation in the ecological era is entirely independent of whether we believe in climate change, good green citizenship, or even practice recycling. The collective outcomes of these changes have burst into everyday reality, so that Joe Bloggs in the street actually understands the world in constant flux and the new rule set because of the internet. And people's engagement with the internet has broken down this notion of hierarchies, form of order, the fact that you can only be in one place at one time. All of a sudden, you're transgressing geographical boundaries, cultural systems, being able to be in multiple places in multiple cities all at once, all at the same time. And so the Pandora's box of complexity is wide open. And yet, we're really only given one tool set to deal with it, based on industrial age designs and systems and ways of thinking. Now, whilst we are modeling these in more complex ways, like through cybernetics and computer programming is getting more complex, essentially there's almost a mismatch between these two worlds, where we slip between two discontinuous models of thought, like fish that don't know that we're wet. So with emerging forms of computation, different kinds of ways of counting, there is a prospect of broadening our engagement with these ways of looking at problems and challenges, and being aware of which kind of mode of thought that we're using may help us develop and use more appropriate tool sets for a whole range of different challenges. And to give you an example what that means in practice, one example of the hardest problems in robotics was the hierarchical control of hand grip around a drinking glass to stop the glass slipping out of the grasp of the robot. And using the typical industrial object-centered mechanical approach was an incredibly, almost insoluble task. And then one day, a group of roboticists came along and used stretchy materials. And I can see a whole generation of roboticists slapping their heads at that moment, going, of course, we use stretchy materials, this problem of grip, it's a no-brainer now. And this simple move has made radical consequences. The importance of the stretchy materials, of course, they have non-linear properties that we can't easily model using classical systems. And it's actually given rise to a new field of robotics, perhaps most unsurprisingly called soft robotics. It's real. They're making an awful lot of cephalopod tentacles at the moment. So when you see cephalopod tentacles, that's pretty much where the field of soft robotics is right at this moment. It's early stages, and there's some fantastic work going on, particularly by the Whitesides group in Harvard. But it's an amazing and emergent field where you can see these two colliding worlds trying to figure out principles of practice for a changing set of solutions. So, what does a droplet solution mean in an architectural context? What does it allow me to do that wasn't previously open to me? Well, if I can counter, order, and sort differently, I can construct different kinds of materials. I can use different approaches to previously established modern paradigms for making forms of architecture. For example, rather than using construction cranes for La Sagrada Familia here, which is, of course, Gaudi's great cathedral work in Barcelona, where he's got beautiful, beautiful, beautiful organic details in the stonework. What about a building that actually grows, self-repairs, or physically adapts to its environment? Not notionally or metaphorically, but quite literally. So my research is situated within a field within architecture called experimental architecture. I'm not what you would call a classical architect. Essentially what I do is I look at alternative possibilities for architecture in terms of design, practice, construction, by working with projects that challenge existing mores and ways of working, and creating experiments, prototypes, and installations that help us understand how these could be realized. So I would include work like the artist Roger Hjorns here as being a part of an experimental architectural portfolio where an abandoned building in the east of London was sealed in reinforced steel plates, filled up with boiling supersaturated copper 2 sulfate solution, left for 2 weeks, and then it was drained. And what was left was this beautiful kind of a violet blue interior to the building. The crystals were particularly large around light fittings and around the bath because, of course, there was less surface for nucleation. In other words, the crystals could grow a lot bigger. So there were fist-sized crystals around the light fittings. Now, why would we want to do this? Well, we want to do this because ideally for this, coming century, millennia, we really want to produce ways of working with the built environment that don't inevitably damage our surroundings. What if it was possible to create buildings that were actually good for and worked alongside the natural world? So if we do that, we're looking at a practice of natural computing. So with natural computing, we might be able to produce structures and systems that actually have different kinds of impacts on our lives and on our environment. Like this BIQ house in Hamburg. This was opened this week by Arup for the first time to the public. It's real. This isn't a rendering. You can actually now go to Hamburg, which I will do as a proper pilgrimage, to actually touch and feel it and marvel at its amazingness. And what you're looking at is the outsides of the panels of this building. And you can see jellyfish, like at the bottom of those panels. Now, those panels have water. In the water live little green cows called algae, so microalgae. They munch on sunlight and carbon dioxide, which is coming through this air. The air is actually being channeled through those little sticks at the bottom, because that actually stops the algae from sticking to the windows, so it's actually a self-cleaning system. And essentially what they're doing is they're harvesting this material, drying it as biomass, and then burning it back within the energy systems of the building. I think it's a bit of a waste. I think we do more with it, but it's a start, and I love it. So, I mean, these opportunities to work differently with the resources that we have are real. And whilst we have a set of tools that help us get to certain points, I'm very interested in how we keep on developing that portfolio and how we, specifically in architecture, are able to produce, say, carbon negative architectures, or if we make ecological footprints instead of carbon ones. So, essentially, now I'm able to look at a different kind of computing and how it might be applied. And really, what I'm trying to do is to work out how I can sort, order, and develop a portfolio using what I'm calling bio or living architecture, where instead of insulating our homes against nature, they're integrated with the natural world. But firstly, let's just go back to counting just for a second. Why is this a different form of counting? Well, when you're thinking about life, Ilya Prigogine, a Nobel-winning chemist who wrote a lot in physics, of course you do, he described living systems as being dissipative. Okay. So dissipative structures are far from equilibrium processes which take in massive amounts of energy from their environment and chuck it out. And in the process of doing that, they have an apparent structure. Now, Ilya Prigogine described this as being the fundamental process for life. So in his world, life is a dissipative structure. We've got lots of natural examples of this, from growing crystals to tornadoes and even the birth of galaxies. So I'm just going to use this tornado here as an example to get us thinking about what the number 1 might represent here, okay? So the number 1 in a living system has paradoxical properties, okay? It enables them to shape the flow and behavior of matter. They may be thought of, the 1 is a dynamic, leaky object that interacts beyond its boundaries through active fields. So that 1 tornado, think of a storm chaser coming up to this tornado. It can feel the presence of that twister long before it ever reaches the eye of the storm. So the number 1 is not, it's not discontinuous like our 1 in Turing computation. This is leaky. It's doing something else. So whilst a tornado can be represented by a digital 1, when considered functionally in the natural world, it's continuous. But it's taking in an awful lot of matter and energy until it reaches equilibrium. So effectively that 1 is in some ways an infinite system, because it's locked into this infinite flow, this functionally infinite flow of matter and energy. But in terms of time, it's actually a finite system. So again, paradoxical qualities. It's also continuous. It's connected to its environment, not separate from it. If you starve it of energy and matter, it collapses into something that we would call an equilibrium state. Very quickly does that. And so, you know, the counting process here is actually quite unstable. And, you know, my basic mathematics is going, golly gee, if Francoise is doing quadratic equations and hypercomputation just to look at markets, I'm really struggling to think about how I might start thinking about natural computing as being the basis for my own system. But I think there are a couple of tricks that we can actually play in order to help us navigate what seems to be an almost impossible set of rules to start playing with. I think one of them is to start choosing the right kind of infrastructures. And also, the second thing is to actually allow the system to help me compute. I'm not going to tell it what 1 is. I'm actually going to ask the system what its 1 is. And I think that is the fundamental difference for natural computing. I'm actually a co-designer, not the sole designer of the outcome. So essentially I've mapped it. I don't think you need to get really too bogged down with you know, the differences. But essentially there are very discrete characteristics about why a morphological, natural or unconventional computer, those terms pretty much for our purposes are interchangeable. As I say, it's really a question of ontology, where your thinking is coming from as to which word you use. But essentially, I think the important thing is I'm going to be talking about the functional system. So we're going to replace the idea of a machine made up of lots of objects with this strange idea of an assemblage, which is, you know, anybody who's read Deleuze and Guattari is probably going to be putting their head in their hands and groaning. I mean, it's a cultural theorist term that helps us deal with the cultural impacts of complexity. And I found it extremely useful. I would just like another term, because it doesn't really tell you what it is looking at it. And I think I would prefer to just call the assemblage a natural computer. So essentially, this assemblage, let me characterize it. It's agentized matter. So instead of having objects, you have an agent. In other words, as a dissipative structure, it possesses its own energy, and as it possesses its own energy, it seems to have a will and force of its own. That's the kind of poetic side of me. And when you get these agent bodies loosely coupling through those fields, remember the tornadoes have got this field of interaction that's beyond the object, but it's still very part of the object, it's still very much part of the 1. They start to overlap, and as such, the agents can start to form loosely coupled bodies. So your agents in a natural computer actually are aggregating 1s. They have an intrinsic affinity for each other. So that's kind of strange, but I'm letting the system tell me what this is. So when I say assemblage or natural computer, I'm talking about multiple agents loosely coupling together to form a body that we're going to call an assemblage or a natural computer. And the other important thing about it is that the systems are soft control systems. But again, don't let me put you off with that term. I mean, this is stuff that we already know. We deal with soft control when we're gardening or cooking or minding small children or herding cats. That's soft control. We can do it. It requires a lot from us, but we can do it. We know what it is. So, right, okay, I've set up some ideas about what the number one might be able to do in a natural computer. How on earth do we start constructing something with that? So again, I started really simply. This is like one of my first experiments. And the way that I went about it was to think about how do we build things using fields? Can we think of this form of computation not as being the discrete production of objects, but actually a set of probabilities, a set of likely but not inevitable events that can be provoked by overlapping different kinds of systems. Maybe that is starting to sound complicated, but the experiment isn't, okay? Experiment can be done in your kitchen. On the bottom here, so get yourself a large mixing bowl. On the bottom here, we have a layer of glycerin. Glycerin is characterized by its affinity for water. Glycerin loves water. It can sit with 10 little water molecules on its knee, cuddling them all. It wants lots of water. Above this is another field of olive oil, which just doesn't want to know water whatsoever. So already we've got a tension. That the interesting place is the boundary here, the interface. In natural computing, the interface is where everything happens. All the exciting events happen at an interface. And so the way that I look at what's happening at an interface to do with the story of water, because I'm trying to keep it simple, keeping it simple, stupid, I decided to put food colouring. Food colouring contains a bit of oil, bit of water, bit of colour. That's nice. I can see what's happening now. It's also observable at the human scale. I don't need a microscope. It's also a big bonus. So I get droplets of food colouring. And in that food colouring, I'm just thinking, I can't resist the technical complexity. I'm just going to add a little bit of rock salt here. Rock salt contains impurities that also love water. So I'm just going to give the glycerin a run for its money and have something sucking back on the water molecules that I know it's going to want to steal off the food colouring droplet. So in it goes. By hand, pipette, let the food colouring droplet form at the interface here. And what you see is something really interesting. You see an explosion of movement of salt down into the body of the glycerin as the droplet frankly loses its hold on the water. You also see these sideways movements as the olive oil decides that it's going to pull out all the oil-soluble colour it can possibly handle. And you know, in the moment before anything happens, you see the droplet tremble. You can actually see the molecular forces at work. It's really kind of like, you know, controlled fireworks for the kitchen, for nerdy people who don't really want to cook. I mean, for me, this was a way of trying to set up a way of demonstrating how we might start to design with things that we don't normally design with, so that I can start to develop some way of thinking about a space that I am completely at sea with. I am not familiar with this space, but yet I can apply it. I applied it to a laboratory performance, as part of the Secret Cinema premiere for Prometheus in an empty warehouse in London at the invitation of Liam Young and Kate Davis in collaboration with the Secret Cinema. And so the laboratory was dressed as the Brave New Ventures set, and they flew over props from Ridley Scott's film, and we had this beautiful rover in the building, which was just such a draw, and these site-specific installations, and really we got the public involved in making other forms of life based on the properties of water, and those that didn't want to see it as life just saw it as a three-dimensional painting that evolved with time, which was fine by me because essentially that's what it also is. So essentially we can also set these things up in other ways. We can look at different kinds of characteristics. Here these are like little artificial frog-spawn embryos that I made for a fashion designer, and it captures this rolling and folding of space that happens during morphogenesis, Alan Turing's favourite I guess mathematical field of interest. And I'm going to just go through quickly now some of the experiments that I've done, just to show you how some of these principles are kind of bleeding into, I guess, technological ideas. So this is a nasty, hairy, ugly, nuisance seaweed that lives around European shores. It's about the size of your hand. It's called Bryopsis plumosa. And I went out to the Black Sea, of course I did, to have a look at why was I going to go to Clacton-on-Sea when I could go to the Black Sea? So I looked at it out there, and what we did with Alexandru Vladimirescu is to have a look at it in its natural habitat, where it suffers extreme conditions on the shoreline, lots of light, lots of trauma, and the poor little organism gets destroyed by this raging site that's called the shoreline. But it has an extraordinary survival tactic, and that is it can survive complete mechanical destruction. Okay, so if you take it and treat it like sushi, you cut it up with a razor blade, and then you introduce it into an environment slightly alkaline, that multi-nucleate giant cell, so it can do it because it's not got all its eggs in one basket, okay? It's little nuclei, the things that drive the metabolism of the cell, the things that make the protein, the things that make it living, are spread everywhere. So if you gather them all up again, pick all the bits up, put them in a little pot and allow them to fix themselves, it will. And as it does so, it's got, if you think you eat junk food, you've got nothing, no hold on it like this thing does. This will eat magnetic particles in its junk food binge for survival. It eats everything it can. It will reassimilate its entire environment if it can. So that's its secret for eternal life after complete mechanical destruction. It gets one chance, so it invests properly. What I've done here, and it was a really bad photograph, but I used some weak fridge magnets so that when this body was reconstituting itself, I could create this symbol of infinity, which of course is the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail. And so let me just go through these very quickly. The system that I've done most work on, of course, is this system, the Dynamic Droplet. And essentially, this is where the programming story really starts. This was my epiphany, and this is a film by Martin Hanzuk and Takashi Ikegami, who showed this at the Artificial Life 11 conference in Winchester in 2008. I remember the moment very well. Organized by Seth Bullock even. And essentially this is for me a metaphorical and literal birth of a new technology. You can see that a non-DNA based system is producing a shedded skin like an amniotic sac. And when I saw that, I wanted to figure out how we could design with those kinds of agents. And so we kind of try to model them to try and figure out, this is what wild type looks like. This is what, if you take the alkali, so it's essentially a soap making recipe. You take soap, this is like the woman in the detergent advert, really proud of the dirty football shirt, sticks it in the washing powder. Wow! All the dirt is busted off the football shirt. Look, it's all gone away. And that's exactly what you're looking at. You can see these little snaky, funny, amoeba-ishy, like droplets. That's really what you're talking about. You can see this. You can see this with the naked eye. There's no magnification here. They've been stained, obviously, with food coloring so that you can see, them quite clearly because they're actually colorless and they don't pick up very well under a camera. But we tried to model some of these. And as you can see, our ways of modeling them using Autodesk, who were absolutely awesome, and we worked in collaboration with Carlos Olguin and his team at the BioNano Programmable Matter Group at the research unit in Autodesk. But really, I mean, frankly, I didn't really understand enough about what's happening within these dissipative structures to be able to model them exactly. Although we could get some homologies, we could see where some of the models we were producing had likenesses to some of the behaviors, but certainly we couldn't get anywhere near the range that was being produced by a physical system. To add complexity to the environment, what I tried to do was to scale this up. So the first thing I did was to make them bigger. So going from the native form of about 1 millimeter in diameter up to several centimeters in diameter, I added actually waste products from the system which slowed it down, changed the behavior somewhat, but it was still interesting. And this is an installation in Vienna. In this one, you can just about see in the background, we're actually starting to get banding patterns, and those are Turing bands. So Turing, in his paper in Morphogenesis in 1952, proposed that these reaction diffusion fields would produce bands, particularly dappling, in biological systems. Now, since then, we've attributed that to RNA, like little genetic programs coming from biology. But actually, in a chemical system, Turing's banding theory is absolutely correct. So we managed to get these Turing bands forming using a chemical system. So I'm now feeling kind of like I'm working with a set of rules that are starting to give me results that I'm finding recognizable in other places. And what's kind of interesting is the degree of lifelike behavior that is emerging out of this system. This system has no DNA. This is not in any shape, way, or form alive. There is no central program. This is a distributed way of counting, sorting, and ordering. And as I showed, hopefully with those Autodesk models, we don't really understand how the individual units are working. So if we don't understand how the individual units are working, let's forget about the units because they're the ones and they're going to do their own thing. Why don't we just work in populations? So just pretend that we have some idea about the one. Now, this is my favorite movie of all time. Lots of little ones coming together, home team, away team, bit of a scuffle in the middle. And what we see is, befuddles me. I'm still trying to find the language and stop myself getting extremely excited every time I see it. So what you're seeing is a phase transition. In other words, this is as a technical system, this is doing something completely different to machines or cybernetic systems. It is capable of complete transformation. And that, for me, is an amazing potential for a technical system to utterly transform. So in other words, we're not looking at universal programs, we're looking at discontinuous programs. At a certain stage, a tipping point is reached, and another program, another way of counting, sorting, and ordering is introduced into that same system. That becomes really interesting from a computational perspective for me. The nearest I can get to modeling this was when I came across Stefan Raffler's Smooth Life, which is a form of cellular automata based on Conway's Game of Life, but there's some kind of smooth function in there. I have no idea what that means other than it's a continuous form of cellular automata, but it looks much more like the system that I was working with from a chemical perspective than the mathematical models. So I'm just going to quickly go through some installations. This is where it gets big, really big. to scale up even further, I start distributing the droplets in a big scaffolding, a hylozoic scaffolding that's looking at this over a room-sized installation at the Venice Biennale. Then we propose models that can actually go, and we actually do lagoon-side experiments for Venice itself, thinking about how we might use light-sensitive protocells, or these smart droplets, to actually build an artificial limestone reef underneath the city, and so spread its weight over a much broader area and stop it sinking notionally into the soft delta soils on which it's been founded. And this actual process takes place in the waterways already. So again, potentially we've got a technological program that could work with and alongside life. And this is a visualization of how that might appear. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with the possibility of designing architectures with physiologies. This is a speculative project by Philips, the microbial home, where bioprocesses are being used to produce energy that can be reworked within the systems, within a kitchen system. So composting is used to produce energy, bacterial biofluorescence is used to produce lighting, and a whole range of domestic functions that would normally be carried out by machines are also being engaged in these kinds of installations. And notice they don't just all look like slush. You know, there isn't a compost heap in the middle of the kitchen. There's actually, you know, containers. There's ways of designing with these systems that help us engage, you know, more strategically with them. This is another real project by Studio Architecture that looks at algae as a curriculum within a sixth form centre in Twickenham. So the business models, the procurement systems, the technical systems, the social systems are all embodied in the study of this installation, which again, a Scandinavian project. Now I wish we'd jumped up and down at the beginning. So essentially for me, this is my last slide. So, you know, as we're looking to the future of our cities, you know, we're looking for sustainable and smart initiatives on a worldwide stage. I'm particularly looking forward to an age of experimental architecture, where we don't know the outcomes of a lot of these interactions, that we actually create these platforms for multiple engagements, for thinking in different ways, for experimenting without having to invest billions and billions in these initiatives. Do it through community engagement, do it by opening up our laboratories very much to, you know, communities that want to work in this way, and even have more fun. And I think that perhaps we could even regard these convergences of nature, humans and machines as synthetic ecosystems. You know, potentially they can help us as we sort, order and count in new ways. Play a mutual relationship with the natural world, which can take an interest in our continuous survival. And these opportunities for me start to speak of realizing Francoise's dream of an applied mathematics and computation of life. And so just really not forgetting the questions that were on my mind at the beginning of this talk, really, not forgetting to stay on track with the fact that our technical logjams sometimes require us to think about our thinking processes, collaborate, be more radical and philosophical and experimental in trying to deal with some of these challenges, and, you know, build partnerships that help our thinking become expansive. And, you know, whilst reduction and simplification is certainly an incredibly effective tactic, sometimes we have to try something else. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel. That's brilliant. I think we've got time for about 2 or 3 questions before the next speaker.
Press the button. Hello?
Oh, hello. Yes, I can hear you.
That video that you described as being the most exciting video you've ever seen.
Yes.
Was that on a screen, or was that real things moving around there?
Yeah, no, it's a microscopic view of a petri dish. The droplets that you're actually looking at are about a millimetre in diameter. It's done at room temperature. So you're looking at a microscope. The magnification here is ×4.
So the things that are there, they are they're not alive.
No.
They're just things that have materials that
Yes.
have certain properties
Yes.
that you put into an environment, and you've seen them behave as if they were alive.
Yes, correct.
Right.
Yes.
That's fascinating.
And this is not the only video. I've got a number of videos that show. So once you stop thinking about how the unit works and you actually start to look at them in populations, so once you start obsessing about what's the number one mean, when you start looking at them on population scales, you actually start to see some really interesting things. And it's something to do with accounting, but I can't systematically describe exactly what that is. And it's not that we're not trying to answer it, it's just that it's beyond our ability to communicate those concepts right now. I don't think it's magical. I think that we will have words to describe it, at some stage. But I think right now, it's challenging. But I think we kind of let it live and do more of it. And we might be able to start to see ways in which we can enter into this space in different ways. And I certainly think that there is a role for digital computing in this, but almost as a kind of parallax, which is why, Francoise's view, that, if we just stick with one system, we won't see this because we didn't think it was possible, because we've convinced ourselves that life is something that's built up by little bits, and when we get to a certain complex tipping point, then that's the moment at which the object becomes autonomous from its environment, and that's what we're looking for. And that's such a narrow search field. It's a very narrow search field when there are all kinds of other possibilities. But how we engage with the unknown unknowns, I think for me is part of the joy of experimental architecture, and bringing in fresh minds and fresh groups of research to help explore some of these possibilities.
Luke Taylor, University of Bristol. Just coming back on the last thing you said there about fresh minds.
Yes.
I'm interested in how it relates to how we educate young people who are coming through to think without boundaries, rather than always basing their future thinking on concepts that have been introduced from when they first start school and before.
Yeah, so I think that's a fact. It's absolutely perfect, and it's so true for the smart city right now. I mean, we need to be able to think across disciplines outside of academia, into the community, into businesses. So what we're doing at the University of Newcastle, we have an MSc in experimental architecture. You don't have to be an architect to participate. So it's open to engineers and scientists, as well as artists and designers. And we're creating a cluster, or we're planning on creating a cluster of MSc modules that students can come to mix and match, to think about smart cities of the future. So they could have a planning module, they could have a landscape module, they could have an architecture module, and encouraging students to actually get qualifications. I mean, so they're obviously postgrads, they obviously have some kind of disciplinary structure to kick against. And then at the MSc level, we're hoping to be able to immerse them in environments that start challenging them and help them think outside of their own forms of education. But I recognise that MSc is quite late in the day to be doing it. I think there's a weird time, I think, in our education where around about the age of 13 we start to understand that we're not supposed to know things within certain disciplines, and that's actually not part of our remit. I remember working with some classes in synthetic biology with the Art Science Group UK here, and we had a group of 13-year-olds and a group of 17 to 18-year-olds who were obviously at a college. And the creativity and the ability to think across disciplines at the age of 12 and 13 far exceeded that of the 17 and 18-year-olds. So they'd learned somehow or other not to think in that in that particular gap. And I think there's a huge opportunity there. So I think your question is a really, really important one, and I think it's something for further education and education institutes to really get stuck into.
Thank you. I'm sure we've got lots more questions for you, but we'll probably need to have a think about them first. But thank you ever so much, Rachel. That's been a really thought-provoking presentation. And can we just give another round of applause to Rachel?
Thank you so much.